our beaches are still closed here. So although I'm 5 minutes from the beach, I can't walk on the beach, and won't be able to do so, I think, for a little while yet. So there we are. And you must be experiencing similar constraints where you are.
We did have lockdown, but South Australia hasn't had a coronavirus case for, I think in the last month, we've probably had last 3 weeks we might have had 2 cases. So we're almost coronavirus free. Yeah, yes. We're COVID free. We are COVID free for this.
Great.
We're told we are.
Great.
But our states have borders, so we can't go, you can't fly anywhere. And we can't go to New South Wales because there's police at the border. We can't go to Western Australia because there's police at the border. Can't go to the Northern Territory because there's police. So we're locked down into our states throughout the whole country. Every state is locked down. But we've got 4 states now that are either COVID-free or they've just got 1 case. So 4 out of 7, I think we've got. So we've only got the big ones, maybe states and territories, 4 out of 8. Yeah, so I watch Andrew Cuomo every night.
We can still travel within the US, but of course most people are not doing anything of the kind. Our daughter and her children, son-in-law, are in Boston, or on the outskirts of Boston, and we haven't seen them for 2 months, but we will go and see them on Monday, and actually bring the children, our little grandchildren, back here for a week so that they can have a break from being locked down at home. They can come and lock down with us instead.
After a week, you'll be ready to hand them back. So the way my class runs is people can select an archaeologist, the one that they think is most interesting, who has made great contributions to the discipline, and then they do a profile of their archaeologist and present and tell the class about them. So it's a way of teaching the history of archaeological thought, but through people, so it's more interesting. And Marc chose you at the beginning of class. Marc, I'm going to twist the thing from you to Marc because it's very interesting why he chose you. Marc, can you tell us? Tell us why you chose Andrew.
Well, basically, the Younger Dryas Impact Hypothesis is the reason that inspired me to go to university in the first place. And since you're one of the most prominent archaeologists within that publishing area, and you published your recent paper, I figured I'd choose you. Plus, I'm really interested in the origins of agriculture as well, and that's right up your alley. So, yeah.
Did the fact that I'm still alive have something to do with it?
That definitely played a part, yes.
I think that was a bit the cherry on the cake, but sometimes they choose dead people. I can tell you a lot of I get Gordon Child every year.
Yes.
Mortimer Wheeler often pops up, and Petrie, and so it just depends. Whoever, and they choose themselves. So there's no, I might give them ideas, suggestions if they want, but. So, okay, so what we're wanting to know is a little bit about how you became the archaeologist that you became. So do you mind just telling us how you first became interested in archaeology?
Yes, all right. So we'll go back right to the beginning. When I was a 12-year-old schoolboy, and in those days I lived in Plymouth in England, in the southwest of England. That's where my family's from. And a very perceptive schoolmaster gave me a book to read and said, hey, I think this should be of interest to you. You read this. And the book was God's Graves and Scholars, translated into English from the German, written by C.W. Serum, or I think that's how his name is pronounced. It's a book about great discoveries in archaeology. Was absolutely hooked on the accounts of these wonderful discoveries, classic things like Tutankhamun, woolly digging at Ur, the discovery of Maya ruins, and so on, and thought this was pretty neat. And so from that moment on, I began to read quite seriously in archaeology. And in those days, you could get into archaeology in a practical sense at a pretty early age, because all over England there were county archaeological societies, most of which ran a dig in the summer. So when I was 16, which was the earliest age at which you could participate, I went off on digs in Cornwall for the most part, because that's where my family spent our summer holidays. And I'd go off digging with the Cornwall Archaeological Society for a couple of weeks. Each year you camped out and dug on Romano-British sites, Neolithic henges, Iron Age hill forts, all of this kind of stuff. And so in my late teens, I got a great deal of practical experience there, which I took with me when I went to university. But in those days, there were very few places where you could study archaeology and at university level. And by the way, there was no career structure. So the idea that in the 1960s you would set out to be an archaeologist was highly improbable. So I read history as an undergraduate, but continued to go on digs and got more and more seriously involved with archaeology. And so I did begin to think about whether, I could turn this into a career. I didn't know whether that was possible or not, but it was clear that I needed some serious academic training if I was to even take one step in that direction. So when I'd finished my undergraduate degree in history, I went off to London for 2 years to the Institute of Archaeology there, which ran a whole series of master's level degrees, basically professional degrees in how to be an archaeologist. I took what was called a diploma in prehistoric archaeology, a postgraduate diploma in prehistoric archaeology under Professor John Evans, and that combined serious study at the graduate level of prehistory through the early civilizations with practical training in things like surveying, artifact drawing, conservation, museum studies, and all the rest of it. And then when that was all completed, I went back to Oxford to do my DPhil. As an undergraduate, I dug with Kathleen Kenyon in Jerusalem, so she naturally became my supervisor. And my interests then were focused very much on the Neolithic rather than the beginnings of agriculture, and we can discuss that distinction later. The Neolithic in Western Asia, particularly in Levant. Again, some introduction to the field was necessary, so I went off to the Middle East for 2 years, traveling around, looking at sites, and seeing museum collections and so on, to build the basis of knowledge that I needed before I tackled the doctoral dissertation work itself, and that then followed. I think probably that's enough to get us going in that direction.
No, that's great. Marc, if you have any follow-up questions that you want, just jump in. I know I am going to ask about Kathleen Kenyon because we did have had someone present on her this week, didn't we? And Kathleen Kenyon. Did someone do Morty Wheeler or no? Mortimer Wheeler?
Not this week, as far as I know. But that's what I was going to ask. What was it like to work alongside Kathleen Kenyon?
Well, she was rather complex. No, let's put it this way. There were some paradoxes there. She was short of stature, but such a commanding figure in the field that you didn't notice the fact that, often you were looking down at her, and I'm not tall, but her personality was so strong. She came across to most people as a rather aggressive, blunt personality, and many walked in fear of her. But what that did, it was really a front, because she was a very shy person, and only opened up in the companionship of very close friends, of which she didn't have many, and surprisingly her students. On the rare occasions we could get her away from official duties, and on her own, she would become quite charming, a good company. She seemed to revel in interactions with the young. We all worshipped her. We thought that she was just, the most impressive person that you could meet or study with. And I'm talking about her other graduate students. She also was incredibly loyal. She and I did have disagreements from time to time. One in particular, which I could talk about if you wanted. But she remained a very strong supporter of me right down to the very end until her death. And I took that as a life lesson, that when you mentor students, there's a commitment there on both sides that should be sustained well into professional life.
Yeah, a kind of loyalty. It is because you do give and get so much from those relationships, don't you?
Yes, you do.
I do want to know what you argued about with Kathleen Kenyon.
Well, it was quite simple. When I started work in Syria and was given the opportunity to excavate at Abu Hureyra, the question came as to who should, sponsor the dig from the British perspective. Relations between British archaeologists and the Syrian authorities had gone back and forth for decades, but no one really had worked in Syria for quite some time before I came along as a graduate student. And that was because the Syrians had had bad experiences with British archaeologists in their country. And it was made quite clear to me that they expected me to take a rather different direction in all of this. And by the way, I was coming in under the auspices of the French, a group of French archaeologists who were respected by the Syrians. It was the French who introduced me to the Syrian authorities. And it was really because of their patronage that the Syrians took me seriously and gave me the opportunity of choosing and digging the site of Abu Hureyra. Kathleen Kenyon, on the other hand, had political considerations in mind. She wanted to use my dig as a stalking horse for getting, extending the remit of British schools of archaeology in the Middle East, particularly the school in Amman. And she hoped that I would take British school sponsorship. And so this would become a British school sponsored dig, which would help her and her ambitions for that particular school politically. I knew that this would be a death knell of the project in Syria. And so we had a disagreement. She insisted that I have British school support. I said, no, this would kill the project. And so we disagreed on that. She was receiving advice from other people who were saying, well, let's use Andrew's dig to further this aim. So, I was out of favor for 9 months. However, she was as loyal as ever. We'd had this disagreement. But she made sure that I got support from the University of Oxford instead, which was a sort of neutral supporter. So in the end, this dig was sponsored by the University of Oxford, particularly the Pitt Rivers Museum and the Oriental Institute in Chicago. And both of those were perfectly acceptable to the Syrians.
And so the French didn't sponsor it, they just brokered it in a sense, brokered the relationship.
They provided the introductions that I needed to be a person of note in Syria. You needed somebody to, introduce you, who would vouch for you. And, on the strength of their support, I got permission to go and look at museum collections and visit sites and so on.
How old were you at that time?
Early 20s. I was, let's see, this was when I was 24. Going on 25. I was married later that year. This is all 1970. The Syrians, in 71, my wife and I, my new wife and I came back and dug with Henri de Contenson outside Damascus at Tel Aswad. So that allowed the Syrians to see me in action on a dig. And it was then that they were looking for archaeologists to go and dig in the Euphrates Valley where they were building this dam. So it was at the end of the Aswad season, that spring of 71, that they gave me the opportunity to go to the Euphrates and find a site to dig. We looked at Abu Hureyra. That was the site that appealed the most. And I said, right, I'll be back in 72 and we'll start work. Well, it took a year, of course, to raise the money. But we came back in 72, dug for 2 months in the summer and fall of 72, and then the big season in 73, where we're in the field for 4 months. So 6 months in total on the site. We left on December the 6th, 1973. They closed the sluices on the dam in March of 74. The site went under 10 days later.
Wow, wow. So you did everything that could be done in that time.
It wasn't possible. We didn't have the time to open those trenches up to any extent to explore the site really horizontally. So although we've largely confirmed the sequence of occupation on the site, which was a major aim of the project, we had by no means the time to explore the site more systematically than that.
Such a shame, because that site has such potential.
It does, but we did make a huge effort to recover animal bones and plant remains, which was the new thing in Syrian archaeology. Really, we came away with 2 tons of animal bones and 500 liters of plant remains. These were unprecedented quantities of material for studying the economy of the site through time, changes in the economy of the site. No one had ever collected samples on that scale before, and they're still with us and accessible for science.
And that's part of that processualism really starting to grow and get momentum at that time as well. So looking at environments from that perspective.
That's particularly interested in the economic side of prehistory. I thought this was pretty fundamental, and also in the impact of the environment on people's way of life, and those were among the preoccupations we had when we went into the field. But certainly to begin with, getting the sequence of occupation on the site, learning more about the development of the Neolithic in the northern Levant, in that part of Western Asia, that was fundamental. And then we wanted to at least recover the evidence that would allow us to say something serious about economic and environmental change afterwards. But when you're digging, you get a sense of the cultural sequence on a site pretty rapidly as you look at the material as it comes out of the ground, in our case mostly flints. And then it's much later when you get to grips with the study of the animal bones and the plant remains that you realize that you do have evidence for both environmental change and economic change in your hands. But that took decades to sort out afterwards.
Well, there's an enormous amount of material to go through as well, wasn't it?
Yes, it was. And so, we raised the money to do the dig and put out some preliminary publications. But as we confronted the enormity of the task of dealing with 2 tons of animal bones, all carefully sieved, and the plant remains, it was clear that we would need additional research monies, and indeed have to devise separate research projects or distinct research projects in order to just undertake the study of these things. Well, from the beginning, I'd adopted a team approach. So before we even started, I'd lined up Gordon Hillman for the plant remains and Tony Legg for the animal bones. So it was a threesome that undertook the dig. Gordon came into the field with us. Tony never made it. But so I dug the site. With a very large team of students and workmen. We operated on a sort of a very large scale. All told, in 73, the team of workmen and students was 50 strong. So we were going at this on a very considerable scale and at a brisk pace. But when we came back, when it was all done, it was really Tony and Gordon who raised the money to hire research assistants and undertake the study of the bones and the plant remains. So Tony teamed up with Peter Rowley-Conway, who now, of course, is a professor at Durham, and Gordon enlisted the help of Sue College, who's still in London, of course, doing this kind of stuff. And so they formed distinct teams. And then we also recruited Tyre Mollison to look at the 200 burials, some of them more recent, others Neolithic that we excavated. And Tyre, thank God, is still with us too, and still publishing on this stuff, believe it or not. None of us has ever stopped. We just keep going.
So that challenge, that must have been an enormous challenge to coordinate such a big team.
It was, and it had its ups and downs. So there were times when we were all wandering off doing other things. We had careers to make, incomes to earn, families to raise, all of those kinds of things, and students to teach. So we went in different directions. I went off to the United States. Tony stayed in London. Gordon was all over the place. He was in Ankara, then he was in Wales, and finally he ended up in London. But as the work began to take on, shall we say, a more formal character, as we began to get significant results out of all of this, and I'd include the involvement of the Oxford Radiocarbon Lab, because they used us as a guinea pig when they started to develop accelerator radiocarbon dating. We were one of the first projects on which they unleashed this new method, which is why we got so many accelerator radiocarbon dates for free, by the way, at the beginning. And that, of course, revolutionized the chronology of the site and indeed of the Neolithic in Western Asia. But, as all of this began to happen, it was necessary to get our act together and begin to think about some sort of final publication. So we began meeting once or twice a year in Tony's lab in the basement of the extramural department in Bloomsbury, London. So we met on a regular basis once or twice a year and began to pool our results. And that lasted, well, it took 12 years to pull that manuscript together. So this was, 10, 12 years of collaboration, which also had its ups and downs. But slowly the thing came together. And I would say, looking back, that was one of the most important research collaborations that I've ever had, because there was enormous mutual respect. Gordon was a near genius when it came to plant remains. Tony had a practical sense about animal behavior, as well as, just how you analyze, animal bones, that was invaluable. So these were, top-notch people in their field, and Tyre joined us from time to time, and, she knew more about human anatomy and human skeleton than anyone alive. So I was working with really the top people, and because we were totally different personalities. So all of that had to be managed as best we could. But as we sat around that table and argued through what it was we were dealing with, we learned that all of these different perspectives had to be brought together. And it was only when there was agreement, when there was alignment, had we got the story right. If the animal bones were going in one direction and the plant remains were going in another, we realized that something wasn't right about the interpretation. And it might take another 6 or 12 months to, sort that out. So we kept going back and forth, back and forth, back and forth, until we had an agreed story for how all of the different pieces of the puzzle fitted together, phase by phase, period by period, through the very long sequence of occupation that we were dealing with. And that's a lesson that has stayed with me, right down to the present. And I've made sure in our project in Croatia, although we're operating on a much less intense scale there, that's a more modest project, but still the same lesson applies. Everything has to fit together, or we've got something wrong.
That's a big lesson. That's very, very interesting. I can see that applying in lots of other contexts. So we have 40 minutes in all, so we've got about 10 minutes left now. So I just would like to, so your early mentors really were, obviously Kathleen Kenyon was a major one. Was there anyone else who was a very big influence on you earlier on?
I think John Evans at London, and he was a quite different personality from Kay Kenyon. From Kay, I learned, how to manage a big project. I learned something of the politics of archaeology. I learned a lot about method because she was the supreme stratigrapher. And I had the privilege of, working beside her in Jerusalem and watch her, analyze the stratification in the trench I was digging on her behalf. So those were big lessons. John Evans was a different personality altogether, a very humane man. He took a sort of humanistic view of archaeology. He was very keen on sort of putting the people back in the past, but he also paid considerable attention to up-to-date scientific method. So, I started out as a history undergraduate at Oxford, and that sort of humanities perspective was reinforced by studying under John Evans, and that stayed with me. On the other hand, I worked extremely closely and continue to work closely with scientists who are rooted very deeply in physics, chemistry, biology, and all the rest of it. My own scientific training was fairly minimal all those years ago, but now I find myself in the thick of discussions about ancient DNA and all the rest of it. So, and I've been working with these plant and animal bone specialists forever. So I see myself as in a position where you try and pull all of these different perspectives together. And it's not to privilege one over the other. It's to bring every single approach together that you can in order to sort out the problems that you're dealing with. But in the end, you've got to come up with some story. You've got to account for what happened to this, that, or the other prehistoric society in the past. I remain a prehistorian. I've not really done much in the historic periods. And then this all has to fit into a larger picture. If you cannot relate what you're doing on your particular site to some larger set of problems, some larger discourse about the human past, then you've got no business to be doing it in the first place.
Yeah, I agree. You mentioned just before about Neolithic and the beginnings of agriculture. Could you speak to that a little bit?
Yes. So when I set out, we were very preoccupied with cultural sequences because we were still building them across the Middle East. The record, particularly for later prehistory, was very patchy. There were some parts of the Middle East that were simply unexplored. And we knew very little about the earlier prehistory, well, practically nothing about Syria, very little about northern Iraq. Of course, southern Iraq pre-Ubaid is under mud, so that's very hard to get at anyway. And Turkey, in spite of the work of people like Jimmy Mellard, was still largely unexplored. So there were huge areas of the Middle East about which we really didn't know much at all. So connecting the regions up was actually rather hard to do. But if you look at a map, and then think about change through time and also passage of peoples through the region at various times in the past, Syria was absolutely crucial because it was the link between the southern Levant, Palestine, and Turkey to the north, and Iraq and Iran to the east. So learning more about the prehistoric sequence in Syria was going to help pull all of those together. And that was very much a preoccupation in my mind. And of course, I was also working on a doctoral thesis at the time, which I call the Neolithic of the Levant, that began way back in the Kabaran and the Natufian, just as a sort of prelude, and finished up in the Chalcolithic. And by the time I'd finished that in 1978, we were able to pull all of this together, and Abu Hureyra the sequence from Abu Hureyra contributed significantly to that. So building these cultural sequences, establishing a proper chronology, identifying the characteristic artifacts and settlement structures and patterns and so on that fitted in all of this was essential. And then on that, you grafted the economic changes, and you tried to set that against an emerging environmental background. At that stage, even then, we didn't know that much about the environmental changes. They are much clearer now than they were then. But once that framework, that architecture is in place, you begin to move on to other questions. And for me, the economic issues, the transition from hunting and gathering to farming, and the environmental changes against which that all played out, the interconnections between those things became paramount. And they've been, I think, my major preoccupation ever since.
Marc, did you have any particular questions that you wanted to ask? Because I just have a little bit more, but I'd like to give you a chance to hop in if you want to.
Well, yeah, I wouldn't mind knowing what you think about how the Younger Dryas Impact Hypothesis will impact our understanding of early human cultural societal development.
I think it's going to have a considerable impact in the short and medium term in this sense. People are still getting used to the idea that abrupt environmental change in the past, however the cause, can have a big impact on human societies. Now, given the fact that we're facing this crisis of climate change in our own time, not just specialists and scientists, if you like, climate scientists, but the public at large is becoming aware that we've got something on our hands that is putting this issue front and center. So it means that people who are thinking about these issues in the past and how rapid climate change has had an impact in the past, there are lessons there to be learned for the world at large today. So this is, how the past can help us understand the present. We are now getting an audience and people are showing a readiness to listen that would not have been the case, say, 10 years ago. So I think the Younger Dryas debate, now I hope more or less concluded, is going to feed into that. But then the question turns to the implications. So, if you take just a single site, Abu Hureyra is the best example. There we see that the settlement was wiped out and then refounded on a rather different economic basis, but life went on. So you have an example there of a catastrophe that impacted one site and presumably many others in the region. We simply don't know because they've not been excavated. And then life goes on, but in an altered form. There is the possibility that this was responsible or largely responsible for the wiping out of much of the megafauna in North America, for instance. It seems to have been associated with catastrophic fires worldwide, and you would expect that that would have been associated with a short-term drop in population densities. But a lot of those follow-on issues have still yet to be explored and tied down to this phenomenon. On the other hand, within a few centuries, people had picked themselves up, societies had reformed, and were moving forward again. So the long-term impact of this is still a little hard to pick out. For me, it's pretty clear that this event played a significant role in the development of farming in the Middle East. It's not clear what its impact was in other parts of the world. Did it, trigger as momentous a change elsewhere or not? We simply don't know as yet. That is still to come. On the other hand, that abrupt climate change can have a major impact on human societies and has done in the past, I think now is pretty clear to everybody.
Professor, thank you so much. It's absolutely been fascinating. You've given us a whole lot of things to think about. We have less than a minute left of Zoom time. I have young students like Marc, and we may cut out, but do you have advice? What career advice would you give them today? What would you say to people in their 20s or 30s who want to be an archaeologist?
Archaeology is one of the most important things that you can ever do or be involved in. It gives you a perspective on humanity that you will get from no other discipline. So wherever it takes you, whether it's to a career in archaeology or a career of some other kind altogether, that perspective is going to be unique to you and of enormous importance in guiding your path through life that is still to come. Think very seriously about the significance of the studies that you are undertaking. They are of profound importance to you and to the world.